Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking from RWK Goodman with me, Ed Wootton, and my co-host, Liam Pape.
Hello.
How are you doing, Liam?
I'm very excited. It's been a nerdy fascination of mine for many years,
Right.
mergers and acquisitions. And just to my luck, that's exactly what this evening, that's exactly what today's episode is about.
Oh yeah? Well, what's happening today? I mean, fill me in.
As the listener will know, Royds Withy recently merged with Goodman Derrick to create RWK Goodman. And in this episode, we speak to Graham Street, who was the managing partner of Royds Withy and who is continuing on with that role and staying as the managing partner of RWK Goodman. And we also speak to Ed Hoare, who was the senior partner at Goodman Derrick and who is now a partner at RWK Goodman. But yes, we do have an absolutely fascinating conversation about why law firms merge, why Goodman Derrick and Royds Withy felt that they needed to merge. But we also have kind of an in-depth discussion about the importance of culture and making sure that there isn't a culture clash. So without any further ado, run tape. Ed and Graham, thank you for joining us. So for full disclosure, I think it's important to point out that Ed and Graham are in fact Ed Wootton and mine's bosses. However, that doesn't mean that we're going to give them softball questions by any extent. No, siree. So, first question to Graham. What is your favourite colour?
Ooh, gosh. My favourite colour is probably blue.
No, you're supposed to say RWK Goodman Burgundy. That's the correct answer.
God, caught out already.
Caught out already. Now let's jump into the proper questions. So, Graham, we will actually start with you. Just for a bit of an overview, why do law firms decide to merge?
Law firms will merge for a number of reasons. On the positive side, I'd like to think that law firms merge because they will see opportunities for strategic growth. From a financial perspective, to strengthen the financial standing of the business. In some cases, to create better economies of scale, as is usual in all growing businesses. And I guess in some cases, law firms merge for less positive reasons as well. So, particularly businesses, law firms that are under distress, or occasionally where the regulators intervene and force a business to effectively close down. But obviously, in our case, we're looking at the positive end of things and the strategic gain. And from our perspective, our merger is capable of delivering that.
So we'll get into that in a second. And Ed, I'll have a question for you in a second. But Graham, just kind of on that, how would a law firm know when the timing is right for the merger?
Well, some of that might be planned, and some of it might not be. So some of it is driven opportunistically by when opportunities arise in the market. And some of it will be based on perhaps a longer term design and longer term sort of plan and execution of that plan. So there needs to be a sense of opportunity, a meeting of opportunity with a desire to merge with the opportunity that arises for one.
So let's bring that back and put it into the context of Goodman Derrick and Royds Withy merging to create RWK Goodman. So a question for you, Ed. Why did Goodman Derrick want to merge?
Well, I think I've been sort of fairly honest about this from before I met Graham, which was that we had been an independent firm for 63, 64 years. And I think the original thinking 2 years ago was we could carry on being an independent firm. And I don't think anyone was pursuing a merger at the time that I first spoke to Graham. But I think what changed and what made us all think differently was really the economic environment. Basically, every year it was getting more and more expensive to remain independent at our size. And then the pandemic came along, so we had a whole load of things to deal with on that front. But ultimately, we realised that we just weren't big enough to be able to put the investment in to be the kind of firm that we wanted to continue to be. But by the same token, nor did we want to jump in with anybody or anyone that we hadn't thought about. So for us, it was market driven initially, and then we all started to think, well, if we are going to combine with someone, who's it going to be? And that is how we got to talk to what was then Royds Withy King.
And just before I ask the next question, it might be worth giving a little bit of context. So, Ed, off the top of your head, do you remember the rough head count of Goodman Derrick and the rough turnover as well? And then, Graham, same question for you.
Well, at what point? When we first started speaking?
Let's do it when we first started speaking.
I think we were roughly 90 people in total, turning over something like 14 million or thereabouts. And then by the time we merged, because of course it was Graham will correct me if I'm wrong, it was probably a 2-year period between our first conversation and merger. We are what we are today. Graham probably remembers better than I do, but 60 to 70 people in total came over, and our turnover's down by a couple of million. So quite a lot less people, but not a huge difference in the turnover that we brought over. So that was one of the things that we were sort of dealing with during that 2-year period.
And Graham, what was the size of Royds Withy King?
Yeah, Royds Withy King was about 470 people and a turnover a target turnover for this year, which we very gratefully delivered, of 40 million. So yeah,
excellent,
a little bit bigger.
So Graham, why did Royds Withy King want to be part of a merger?
Yes, Royds Withy King is a progressive business, or was a progressive business. We are focused on sustainable growth in the market, and we have a recent track record of having grown through organic growth and also through acquisition and merger. Sort of bolt on, and we've done acquisitions and mergers successfully in the past. And 6 years ago, Withy King, as it was then, merged with Royds in central London and built a platform for future growth in the capital and future growth nationally and potentially internationally as well. And that merger was successful, certainly successful in creating a platform for future growth. And the last 5 years have been very challenging economically and politically as well. But really, we were continuing to look for strategic growth opportunities, particularly in London, to build out London and to ultimately build our national profile. So strategic mergers has always been part of our plan. There's timing issues as to when and how often you can do these things successfully, because it's absolutely not about growth for growth's sake. It's about growth to create a sustainable business. And as we have regionalised our business in the southwest, in Oxford and Thames Valley, and in London, we were looking for sustainable and strategic growth in London, and that's how this opportunity came around.
Ed, you just mentioned that the initial conversation started about 2 years ago. How did Goodman Derrick go about finding an appropriate suitor, so to speak?
Well, in some ways we didn't, in the sense that we were always being approached, have been since I was in the management of the firm, on a regular basis. And what was interesting, and Graham may blush, but the difference between Graham and the others was that they would tend to come along to us and say, well, we're not in London, you're in London. How about we combine, and then you send all your work to Office A, Office B, or Office C. The difference with Graham is, I got to know Graham through mutual contacts, and I knew the firm. And ultimately, we started off, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, but we wanted to talk. If we were going to speak with anyone, it would be where I felt there'd be a strong cultural fit, because there wasn't much point going any further unless they were the right sort of people. But I think the difference was that when one spoke to Graham, it was more a question of how can you help RWK build the London office, and it was very much more of an inclusive conversation rather than the normal conversation that we'd had, which was both refreshing, but really the difference, I think, in getting all our colleagues to think, oh, this is a good firm, this is the sort of firm we should be talking to.
And kind of on that, as kind of tabloidy as this question sounds, but do you have any top tips for those discussions, for the negotiations, for almost striking a good deal on both sides, that is? Graham, if you want to pick that one up first.
Yeah. Well, as Ed has already alluded, I think finding a strong cultural fit is the most important factor. If you're going to make a merger successful, and you're going to live together for a long time, then you've got to know each other very well. You've got to like them, and you've got to be able to work with those individuals as well. I think in the nature of our profession is that the culture is really delivered through the people. So it's about finding a good people fit. And people will represent the profile and the personality of the firm as well. So there's lots of tangible sort of things that you can use to identify a strong cultural fit. But so people first, and we're very much a people first organisation, and so we're Goodman Derrick. There has to be a good financial fit as well. So the financial structures have to align with one another, and that means looking at the not just the profit and loss, but also the balance sheet, and understanding the working capital base of the firms, and how those two things can merge and align with one another. And strategically as well, we have to be complementary in terms of strategy. We need to be wanting to achieve the same things in the same market. So we're building strength in depth, as it were, as a practice, rather than diversifying and spreading too thinly. So those were the key considerations for Royds, Withy, King. And that was the shopping list, if you like, of things that we were looking for in a suitable merger partner.
And Ed, same question to you. Any top tips for negotiating a merger?
One of the things that I think is really important about mergers is it isn't, obviously it's a bigger firm and a smaller firm, but when you see people's weaknesses and strengths in the sense that everyone's taking some risk together and we're all joining one partnership, then ultimately that to me is probably a really important indicator for a successful merger. I mean, some of these transactions you see law firms, they don't combine at all. They run one name, two firms. We haven't done that, and we have shared risk completely. And I think that's a really important point.
In terms of Liam, in terms of negotiating, tips for negotiating, Liam, negotiations are critically important, but the stronger the alignment at day one, the stronger the natural alignment, the less there is to negotiate. So, I think we were very fortunate that, throughout our negotiation, there wasn't actually a great deal to negotiate that wasn't based on pure common sense and, commercial pragmatism and grounded in reality. It was as a natural fit. Then the negotiation process was really quite straightforward.
For context, listener, when we were speaking to Graham last week, he kind of used the analogy of a marriage, and I suppose that can be applied here. So our merger sounds like it was quite plain sailing, or relatively. So to kind of pull us away from our specific merger, and again talk about law firm mergers in general. Ed, I'll give this question to you first. What are some of the challenges that firms can face when they're merging? I mean, you just alluded to their kind of mergers that happen, and they very much stay as almost two firms, but under the same name.
Yeah. Well, I think an awful lot of the challenges which happen to law firms that are merging only really become apparent after they've merged, obviously. So, and you start to see when you look at other firms where things might have gone wrong. And I think culture is that we come back to that. But if you don't fit, you don't fit, however brilliant you are on paper. So I think that's the number one. I mean, number two, obviously, is if the economics don't work, however nice you are, then that doesn't work either. But I think there's a third one, which I think Graham and I are trying to be very careful to avoid, or all of us trying to be careful to avoid, which is the sort of the after you, no after you. So I've seen law firms where everybody tries to get a role based on what's fair as opposed to who are the right people for the job. And I think that's super important, is that you just look at it as a business of a combined business as one, not them and us. And that means that you get away from that thinking as quickly as possible and start and move forward very, very quickly to operate as a single unit.
And Graham, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think ensuring that there's a a strong alignment of interests is important. Obviously, in addition to the cultural piece, we have to want the same things, and we have to support each other to achieve them. And that means that on a personal level or people level, we've got to like each other, and we've got to enjoy working with each other. And that's I think we've done a lot of work on. We've had time to work on that beforehand. We spent a lot of time getting to know one another with Goodman Derrick, as we have with previous merger partners, and it is like a marriage. You've got to commit. Once you've committed, you're in it for life. That's the essential premise of a marriage, is that it should be for the long term, not for the short term. So choosing your marriage partner is and choosing wisely is critically important to the longer term success of any merger or acquisition.
The publication The Lawyer ran a piece at the end of last year about consolidation of small to mid-sized law firms. So my question is for you, Ed, and that is, do you think that firms the size of what Goodman Derrick was can continue to exist independently? I can word it better, or is consolidation inevitable? Oh, I like that.
I don't think you can ever say anything's inevitable unless you can read the future, but I think the writing was on the wall in terms of, for us, in the same way as it has been for other firms of our size. I mean, I won't mention, but there are several firms who are well known, who've either become part of a listed entity or an accounting firm, or been swallowed up wholesale, never to be heard of again. But I think it is very difficult to be a full service law firm at that sort of size, largely because the regulatory cost and all the other costs of doing business have just gone up exponentially in the last few years, which means it makes it very, very hard to be profitable doing it that way. And then if you throw in competition from outsourcing and from, the sort of, you like to call it, the barrister's chambers type model, then there needs to be change. So my suspicion is that firms of our size as GD will become fewer and fewer in number in terms of full service, but they may well exist if they're, say, a specialist patent boutique or a one type of service operation. That would be my view.
We've spoke a lot about the importance of it being a cultural fit of two firms merging. But how do you know that it will be a cultural fit before, as Ed, you rightly pointed out, before the firms merge? Because often these issues can rear their heads, but it's always after the merger has happened. So, I mean, again, to give it a little bit more context, Ed Wootton, who was sat quietly during this interview, and I did an interview for the podcast a couple of weeks ago about employee value propositions. So is it stuff like that, making sure that, again, kind of the people-centric part of the way you see your firm is compatible? I haven't articulated that in the best way, but do you get what I mean?
I think I do, yes. I mean, in our particular circumstances, I suppose we spent a lot of time, once sort of management had met management, then we kind of made sure that it went across. And we took our time to make sure that people met up with other people in the same groups and in the same areas. We had associates meeting each other. We even put secondments in place before we'd fully merged to sort of, within the bounds of what we were allowed to do, to make sure that we were had as much cross pollination as possible as we were permitted. And I think that told us every time that actually not only were the people very similar, but actually there were also, to my mind, an awful lot of opportunities both ways in terms of things where we fit really well, where we, one side may have a bit more, one office may have this, may have that, but all sorts of opportunities you discover. So I think it was really finding out by not rushing into it at all. I mean, as I say, Graham and I have spoke for a long time. It wasn't for a year after that, I think, Graham, correct me if I get it wrong, but at least a year before we sort of got into the actual detail. And I think that's important.
No, it was. I mean, we the opportunities were there at the outset, but that opportunity didn't convert until we were some way down the line in terms of just getting to know each other, really. And a merger may have happened and it may not have happened. And the most important thing is that I think Goodman Derrick had some issues and challenges to address, and so did Royds, Withy, King, and you can't rush into a merger until those issues have been thought through and planned, and to the extent that was possible, resolved. So COVID didn't help, arguably COVID did help. COVID put the brakes on it. I mean, during lockdown, there was a limit to how much work, preparatory work, could be done, and how the extent to which people could get to know each other in face to face, as it were, rather than remotely. In a funny sort of way, I think COVID did help, because it enabled us both to take the time to develop a deeper understanding of what we were each individually looking for, but also what collectively we might achieve if we were to get together. And I think that time was time well spent. Ed and I in particular spent a lot of time getting to know each other and sharing some musings, if you like, if we call them musings, or sharing some ideas, but really focused on how we might help each other either inside or outside of a merger arrangement, and without the pressure of having a deadline or a fixed time scale to work to. I think time worked in our favour overall.
Ed and Graham, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating, especially as it rolled on from our EVP conversation a couple of weeks ago with Wiser and everything like that. It's just the way that they talk about it, as you're not looking at it as two firms who are joint, you're looking at it as creating one firm, and that's the best way to go forward. I don't know what you took from it, Liam, with your interest in mergers and acquisitions.
I think just the key is, and as maybe as cringeworthy as it sounds, it's not cringeworthy, but I think the analogy of almost a wedding is a really good one, about finding the right partner. And what struck me was the question about any almost tips and hints for striking a good deal when you're negotiating a merger. It's you can do that as much as you want, but ultimately, if the two firms aren't a right fit for each other, they're not a right fit for each other. And I think that's more important than scraping a slightly better deal or whatever else. But yeah, I think, as was really kind of hit home in that conversation, the importance of avoiding a culture clash is key. And as Ed Hoare pointed out, that's often something that you can try and mitigate before a merger takes place, but often will rear its ugly head after the merger.
Yeah, and I think it was pretty clear how well Graham and Ed kind of gelled together as two partners in what is now the same business. I think very excited to be RWK Goodman, really.
Indeed, and let's hope that continues, importantly.
Yeah, it will, exactly. I'm sure it will, because like you say, you build it on a proper foundation, and you get the feeling talking to them both that they're both on the same page. And I think, they are, of course. So yeah, long may it continue. And welcome everyone from Goodman Derrick again.
Welcome indeed. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'll tease you now that we're going to have some more kind of thought leadership and content coming out around this in the very near future. So keep your eyes peeled for that. If you enjoyed the sound of my voice and my co-host Ed Wootton's voice, then do subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed it as well, do leave us a 5-star review, because that does help with the algorithms and whatnot. Apart from that, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.